presentation is like an event that's happening as a hybrid. I'm here, my name is Heide Hinrichs, I'm teaching here at the Academy in the In Situ department, and I'm also a researcher. And in the context of the research, the Second Shelf project happened in 2018 and 19. And as a final conclusion, the book Shelf Documents was published in January this year. So the hybrid is, in that sense, we have two permanent guests and one who is jumping as a ghost maybe in. And so the two guests that are permanent present are Larson and Tang. Joey is at the moment in San Francisco, so we have also multiple time zones here. Lara is in Columbus, Ohio. She is only 6 hours behind us. And Liz is in Didcot, close to Oxford in Great Britain, and only with 1 hour difference. The connection of both of them to the project are that the project was from the very beginning devised as a collaborative project, and there were 5 advisors, Elizabeth Haynes, Tang, Marissa Sanchez, Susanne Weiss, and Ersi Bavari as an artist here also located in Antwerp. And Laura is not one of the advisors, but she came in at one moment when we presented the drawings and in the Bieler Gallery in Columbus. And Joey proposed her work in addition towards the presentation of the drawings because there's an aspect that we address today also more or go into depth. And yeah, so that is the link next to the photographs that Laura is showing. There's also a book of hers, Hidden Mother, in the collection of Second Shelf, and she has been writing also the introduction, or like not the introduction, the preface towards the book of Shelf Documents. Liz, or Elizabeth, and Joey, they both have been also editors of Shelf Documents with me together, so we have been sharing the whole process. Joey further is to say, so he's in San Francisco as the director of the Cardist Foundation, so as a curator, but at the same time he is practicing as a writer and as an artist. And in his CV he is always writing like that these activities are like equal to each other. There's not one that is kind of put into the foreground. And before working at the Cardist Foundation, he was the director of exhibition at the Bieler Gallery for 4 years in Columbus, Ohio, and before that in Paris, based in Paris, and working there amongst others at the Palais de Tokyo as a curator, and also staged numerous exhibitions in the independent way. And Laura is also a hybrid in her practice, like she's a writer and a photographer. Yeah, that is just to give, important also to say, next to the book of Hidden Mother, she is right now working on a forthcoming book. Laura, help me out. The
City of Incurable Women.
Say that again?
It's called City of Incurable Women.
Yes, and it's coming out with the St. Lucie publisher, the same like where Hidden Mother is published. And she's also working on a book, All the Women I Know, that we will talk more about today. So then to the introduction of shelf documents briefly. Like the beginning of the project was like noticing gaps in the library of the academy here, and that basically many artists I would refer to in the teaching context were not present, female artists, and these were like very substantial artists that are established, like Agnes Martin, for example. And out of this kind of observation, very simple observation, the project of Second Shelf started like to integrate more books of not only female artists, but also as queer identifying artists and artists of color into the holdings of the library, and to create a resource that is accessible for students here, but also like that the diversification, so to say, or the possibilities of identification, finding role models is kind of broadening up. And next to this rather practical act of kind of adding books to the collection, we also thought about like the space of the library, like the space of the book, the material quality, and there was a series of talks hosted in the library in 2018 and 19. This is mostly before, I think, your time of studying here, and out of this contribution, like out of the talks, the contributions to the books came into existence, or were developed, and after or next to that part, we kind of created a network from book to book through like an ex libris, and we made the website, and for each collaborator, maybe it's also or advisor, it's important to say that they took the project into a direction that is connected to their practice, and things to their interests, and Joey, like to point that out at the moment, because you're present, developed a mural site to Second Shelf at the Columbus College of Art and Design, and he basically acquired the same books, but it was also very visible that many more of the books we acquired for Antwerp were already present in the collection at the Packard Library, and also the locality, like maybe into the locality, artist specific to the place, but also the pedagogy was kind of showing in the selections. I want at this point also say like that the design of the book started, or we worked together with Sarah de Bond, like a designer who's based in Ghent, and she designed the ex libris that is in all books. Maybe I can give Hidden Mother around, and then you can take also a look at that. And she introduced the typeface Lelo by Katharina Köhler, a German graphic designer. So her entry into graphic design is that to underline like who is doing actually who's standing behind the design, and she chooses very consciously female designers. And the second typeface that is used in shelf documents is Diotima by Gudrun Zapf. And so, this is something that is running through the project, and because Sarah was involved into the project also from 2018 onwards, like I think a lot of her sensibility could kind of could be reflected in the book. The book, I think I should say that at this moment too was the production of the book was supported by the Academy, of course, but then also by the Bieler Gallery and Kiosk exhibition space and Wheels. So there's a kind of bigger funding behind it. That's I would like to thank all institutions for that. And I think at this point, Joey, you could take over and start to introduce the book.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for inviting me into your sculpture studio, I think, atelier there, which I find it to be such an apt site and maybe even metaphor for thinking about how things come into being and how shapes and voids and gaps are articulated and handled and cared for. And I can't think of a better place you could all be together, which I was there. As Heide mentioned, the book is a compendium to Second Shelf. So when we think about making a book about a project that revolves around books, it becomes a kind of interesting question and conundrum in a way. We wanted this book to have a kind of intimate scale, something you could really hold and feel. And as you can see, the cover also has this drawing by Heide of two hands reaching, wrapping around the book, perhaps. And we also thought about the gaps in the bookshelves and how this book might be miscategorized, misplaced, thinking about precisely the very, at times arbitrary ways of assigning books to specific sections of the library, where books that perhaps could cohabit or inhabit multiple categories can only be, put into one specific place. So we wanted to make a book that precisely doesn't fit in and cannot be categorized. And the small scale, we made a joke that this book will probably fall behind the shelf and behind the books and will just get lost. And so there's this sort of sense of wanting maybe to get lost in the library as well. The book itself, it's divided into different sections, and we really wanted to start from something of a larger scale, the institution, and slowly zoom in to the library, which is the site for holding this kind of the collection, specifically connected to an art school at the Royal Academy of Art in Antwerp, and also where I used to work at Columbus College of Art and Design. And then to the book itself, and then to the idea of listening, which we will kind of delve into a little bit more. It's sort of an odd one to think about listening in books, but maybe perhaps this sense of the quiet that needs to be regulated or either self-regulated or as a kind of rule towards the kind of silence that reading needs. And then later on, and then at the end, to the body itself. So the body that reads, the body that listens, the body that holds the book, the body that is taking up space in the library and therefore taking up space in the institution. So we really think of it as a kind of movement between what holds knowledge and who holds the knowledge. And there are many beautiful contributors in the book. There's David Senior, the head librarian at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, who talks about the power of self-publishing and small publishing houses that need to be supported by institutions that often, through the kind of bureaucratic processes of accounting and budgeting, don't allow these smaller publishing houses to enter the collection of museum book collections. And David was a librarian at MoMA in New York before he came to San Francisco. So he really talked about this need to revise or revisit some of the protocols. In the library section, Liz Haynes talked about the kind of history of germs, and this was also really written during the pandemic. So we were all, we were all unable to enter our own libraries, and so Liz beautifully kind of traces out the history in which the body and the book and the sharing of books become a kind of ways in which we could read into the social aspect of book reading. And then we have Rachel Desmond, who really started from the explosion in Beirut last year as a starting point, and to talk about the various ways in which book reading and libraries in various art spaces have been mobilized as a way of thinking about knowledge sharing, specifically this space called Mansion, which was started by a collective of thinkers and artists, and has a library that is the library that comprises of a kind of shared knowledge. So it's really a kind of snapshot of the interests of the people who inhabit it. And then in the book section, Susanne Weiss, who was the director of the Heidelberger Kunstverein, talked about the different projects which she worked on that connect to the collecting of books. For example, Annette Weiss's sculptural work that takes all her grandmother's books into the museum. So what does that mean to kind of temporarily withhold this knowledge and have them enter into the institution, and the kind of exchange that takes place in that process. And Esty very beautifully punctuated the book with these images of paper being punctured. And so, we're really thinking about the page as a kind of physical space, things that allows one to look through the page. And Sarah de Bond sort of debunks, in a way, the kind of language that is often gendered in the way one might describe topography. So these are kind of, I would say, kind of poetic, critical examination of the way in which we think about font. And maybe this is a good time for me I'm going to skip over Marissa Sanchez's contribution, which has to do with listening, because we're going to be listening to something she refers to. But I want to talk about also Liz Haynes' essay that focuses on the Women of Color Index Reading Group, which was a group that was formed in 2016 by Samia Malik, of an archive that exists in the art library in Goldsmith. at the Women's Art Library in Goldsmith since the 1990s. And Samia particularly talked about her experience as a student and not having the kind of references that she was looking for in terms of thinking about her own sense of self in terms of race and gender in the academy, but then realized some other people had already done some work. But I think that maybe speaks to the larger question: how do our work, how can they be made visible for the future, and the important work that has been done by our predecessors or former students or teachers, and how those efforts could be maintained in a kind of a visible way. Maybe I'll stop there. We'll just share my screen, and we'll be flipping through the book with The Sound of the Loon, which Melanie, Marisa Sanchez talked about as a way of call and response, as a kind of how knowledge operates. Sorry. Sharing.
There's no sound.
One second. Let's do it one more time. Is that it? No? Okay.
No. Shall I start it from here? No. There's still no sound. I also don't hear you.
Maybe I have you share it on your end.
Shall I share it now?
Yeah.
Okay. Alphabet.
Anti-racism.
Archive.
Armpit.
Art workers.
Belly.
Care.
Cataloging.
Feeling.
Commons.
Community space.
COVID-19.
Decolonization.
Dewey Decimal.
Diaspora.
Echo.
Encyclopedia.
Explosion.
Ice.
Feminism.
Foreground.
Friendship.
Governance.
Hand.
Inclusion.
Inheritance.
Intimacy.
Labor.
Librarian.
Library studio.
Line.
Page.
Performance.
Photocopies.
Precarity.
Reproduction.
Responsibility.
Rope.
Serendipity.
Shelf.
Syllabus.
Violence.
Voice.
Whisper. Okay, my turn. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this discussion today. Being involved in this project has been the highlight of a difficult year and a half, and continues to bring great pleasure and delight into my life. So again, it's really great to be here. I'm going to share my screen. I need to kind of, all right. So I'm going to try to, actually in a chronological way, track my participation in second shelf and shelf documents, and just to sort of kind of circle back to something that was mentioned before. I'm not sure if it was by Heide or Joey, but the kind of the wonder of this project for me is that I feel that I have, that I hold multiple identities, and because of the way the professional world functions, that these identities are sort of become professionally siloed. And this has been a kind of rare instance where those identities have all kind of been able to sort of coexist and talk to each other. So hopefully in this presentation, I'll be able to speak to that. Am I loud enough, Heide?
The volume is a little bit high, I think.
Okay.
No? Okay, continue.
Better? Okay. So this is my book, Hidden Mother, and this was, again, my introduction into the project, which Joey brought into the second shelf collection. And this is the first book I ever wrote. So this is in some ways the first book I kind of, where I had a sort of professional identity as a writer, even though writing has always been a part of my practice as an artist, as a photographer. and some of the other things that I get into. But so the book is about, it's about my experience of adopting my daughter as a single mother by choice. And I use this 19th century vernacular form called the hidden mother. And these are some examples of it as a kind of image, as a kind of practice to sort of talk about this particular a way of using these images, using photography as a way to sort of talk about the sort of speculative nature of becoming a mother, and very specifically centering adoption and the ways in which it formulates growing family along lateral lines, as opposed to sort of patriarchal heteronormative lines. So this practice was, again, it was a practical strategy that photographers used as photography was sort of enabling a kind of portraiture to be available in a kind of affordable, democratic way, where you could now make portraits of your child. And so this was a strategy, you know, essentially to sort of isolate the child in the studio. And because such long exposures were needed to make these images, the mother would hold the child to kind of keep the body steady over a long exposure. So some of the strategies they kind of used were, you know, like sometimes they're quite comical, that sometimes they're quite like disturbing and violent, like this, where the emulsion would be scratched. So again, like Joey brought this book into the collection. Again, like I felt a sort of affinity. To me, this book, there's a sort of affinity on some level with the project of Second Shelf, with the notion of an archive, with the notion of foregrounding a practice as a way to begin to sort of speak to certain silences or sort of potentials and looking in an archive. All right, why isn't this? There we I see. All right. Okay, so this brings me to All the Women I Know. So this is a project that I started making these photographs sort of as part of another project called City of Incurable Women, which Heide mentioned earlier. But it was a project that began to have a life of its own. I was really looking for, I think the sort of hook for me was that the work that I was doing at the time was very time consuming, was very administrative. Like I had to sort of like bring lots of people together and like bring different resources and rent sites, and it, like everything was very sort of elaborate at the level of production. And I felt like there was this thing missing in my life that was about a kind of daily contact with my practice. And so I sometimes have described it as a kind of sketching, like a kind of sketching practice, like for photographers. It's not a kind of a neat analogy, but I'll just kind of let it lie there for a moment, because I think this will sort of thread into some of the things we talk about later. So one of the things I was interested in was the idea kind of moving away from hidden mother. So if hidden mother, you know, the women, the mothers, these different figures were sort of marginalized, like what does it mean for there to be a kind of consent between the subject and the photographer, and at the same time working against certain notions about portraiture, which are about disclosure or reveal, and very specifically working with this sort of idea of resisting it, right? Like, you know, what does it mean when the subject turns away from the camera? And so I began to just photograph all the women I know, and it's this is my portrait of Heide that I made when she was in Columbus in early 2020. So I'm photographing close friends, you know, family members, acquaintances, students, like really a kind of very broad spectrum of relationships, right? Like to things, you know, sort of like political attachments, to personal attachments, to like very sort of deep, long relationships, to relationships that are like quite new and perhaps sort of at a moment of burgeoning. And so, you know, it was a little bit like of a question, like how can I sort of make these photographs and then begin to access these different ideas about portraiture as a form of resistance, the sort of notion of like tying my gaze as a photographer to thinking about the gaze and subjectivity of each of these subjects. Sorry, there we go. Beginning to think about the sort of how to make an image of somebody that, you know, in some ways honors that individual, like as an, you know, as a person, but at the same time honors a kind of quiet of the photograph, honors their mystery, that doesn't sort of have a kind of stake, as I said earlier, in the kind of traditional sense of disclosure that kind of gathers around photographs. I make these quickly. I try not to overthink them. You know, again, it's sort of like, how can I begin to sort of expand from these central questions about, you know, the notion of looking at, the notion of thinking about these women as a collective beyond like my kind of attachment to these people. And there's, you know, these are only identified, the titles are only their first names, right? There isn't a kind of explanation of who this person is, right? It doesn't sort of depend on a kind of meeting of gazes, but rather a kind of mirroring that's going on. And this is Gina. This is in the book. I believe this is the first image in the book. Yes, so the only image that is the only person who thus far is, well, I'll sort of roll back for a moment. I think of this as a kind of ongoing project. In some ways, I've been imagining it and I've been working on it for a couple of years now. I imagine it as like an ongoing project, like something that I'm continually working on until, you know, perhaps when I feel that I've exhausted some of the sort of formal questions, some of like the sort of kind of political questions as well, and sort of thinking about this. But most importantly, I really think of this as an archive, like as an archive of images, one that's it's a living document. It's one that is not only continually being added to, but is having a kind of various lives in terms of how I am presenting it. This is Suzanne. The other sort of detail is that the only individual who appears more than once in this archive is my daughter. And this is a sort of, if I set up a rule for myself where I'm saying, you know, there's only one, you know, I'll make a photograph of every person just once, like there's for me like this sort of a way of thinking about the archive and how it's going to live through a kind of thread of photographs with her in there. And I think I'm at my 5 minutes, but this is not sure why it's not advancing. I do want to show this last photograph. I'm not sure why it's not advancing. Do you see the sort of how it's creeping up here?
Yes, we see the same. It's like.
There we go. Anyway, this is got to say, this is my daughter. And I'm going to stop sharing. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Laura. I will start to share oops, like. So I wanted briefly to talk about the drawings, and we did the same, or we decided to show, to talk about Laura's work and the drawings, as it's both about looking at someone else or at the work of someone else. And here, this is not a drawing, it's the Seattle Public Library. It's a Rem Koolhaas building, and I wanted to show that as this is the beginning point of the drawing series. So I was in 2005 in Seattle and moved to, in 2006 I moved to Seattle, and at the beginning I had not a studio. I didn't know where I am. I had to introduce myself to the place, and at that time the building just had opened in 2000, at the end of 2004. I think it was a rather new architecture, and it was a place I felt welcomed, and I visited and I used as a working space. So I have to play a dog play, okay. And here we see the book spiral. It's kind of 4 levels on top of each other. On the floor you see the numbers of the duodecimal system, so that directly guides you through it. And at the end here, like where the person is sitting towards the window, that was one of these working places I was also using. And this is a reading room, and then the architecture of that place, of a library, is really an architecture that's a public space that welcomes everyone, and people use it, and that's something that was important to me. And this is one of the hallways towards the meeting rooms. And when we talked about the structure of the book, like going from the institution towards the body, like the hallway in this red color, like really, seemed like the interior of the space of that library also. And thinking yesterday, I thought, okay, maybe this idea of going from, was also influenced by this experience. So, and then this is the notebook I did these first drawings in, and I never stood still by the point that it's called Second Nature. And also, like at that point, I didn't know what to do, so I just started to make these drawings. These are the first ones, and out of that notebook, and I just made them. And this is 15 years ago, and then later, like I started to think about what does it mean to reproduce something, and how are certain positions in art history kind of established, and to which kind of narration, and how is a canon formed, and in how much, so to say, the educational institution, but also kind of places like books where ideas and narrations are repeated, play a role in this. And here I'm forming this first one. The first drawing was after drawing from Eva Hesse, so I took out the book and redraw the drawing. And then here we have Merritt Oppenheim, and then here that is Louis Bourgeois. And out of this very beginning, so I left them in this notebook, and then later on I resumed this practice of orientating myself in, like, when I was not knowing what to do, like with falling back on this kind of, okay, I draw in this way. And then slowly an archive came, or like a collection came into existence. This is one part. And here is a view how the drawings were presented in at the Bieler Gallery in beginning of 2020, like hanging on ropes and suspended from the ceiling, and the position. And this is kind of the drawing with Laura's work together, like. and then you would see like here it's like in an aisle, like in a library aisle, and it was the same position like in the library beneath, like the exhibition space was built on top of the library, or they're on like a stack on top of each other, and basically these positions were connected to each other, and but also like that was beautiful to see these how something that is in an exhibition space is sourced by something that is actually literally beneath it. And then here I just show like another image of the how the drawings came back into the book, and now like the last image would be like I didn't take it because I was too late in the library, like how the book is entering basically also back the library, or it is how it is in several libraries. And here I think it's good if I keep it short, and I think we would go into the discussion of certain words that we had read from the index.
Should I pick that up?
Yes, please.
Okay. So we decided as a kind of structuring device for a discussion, we would select a few images from the index and sort of, let those words kind of lead the discussion. So I'm going to offer up the first word, which is archive, and which is in many ways a kind of seamless concept. Not only for the photographs that I made that are in the book, but of course thinking about the library as an archive. So as I said before, I think about this project as an archive, and the really critical aspect of it, which I believe sort of connects to some of the larger ideas around second shelf and shelf documents, is thinking about archives as living documents, things that are incomplete, things that are in process, things that are, waiting to be intervened with, waiting to be punctured, waiting to be extrapolated from. And as somebody who also works deeply in archives for my work, I find myself in this kind of interesting place where I'm, I think of it as a resource, but now I'm really thinking about it as a kind of mode of production. And again, I think there's this kind of curious looping quality about this project, again, like I came into this, my book came into it, and then I met Heide and we collaborated on the exhibition at the Beeler, and then, sort of coming, the work being included in the book. And then finally, and, this kind of goes back to my sort of initial, one of my earlier statements where I was asked to write a preface for the book. And then that began to sort of, it became a way to sort of knit all of these different identities together. And in that case, sort of talking about my experience as a teacher and how, how all of these things kind of thread together for me.
Okay, I think one point to add would be like these, the drawings are a very private or a very intimate collection on my end, but it becomes open, and it is drawn open, and it's also something, as you said, like it's something that might be unfinished, and that's the point. This unfinishedness, like the it's now a jump, like the books that are added towards the collection in the library here it's of course like a gesture, and it's unfinished. Like this will always continue. It's more a gesture of kind of we have to be aware of that, who is forming a collection and an archive in that sense, and like it is not automatically arriving in somewhere. Like there are people, there are persons there who take the decisions. And like in the case of the drawings, I took these were my private influences in a library, in an arts institution. It should be like bound back to the syllabus, or it should be bound back to the student body. It should be reflecting what is happening in the world. Yeah. Joey?
I guess something that occurred to us while we were compiling the list of books to enter the collection was we started to see what other books are already there, right? You mentioned, Heide, some of the books the advisors compiled were already in the collection in Columbus. It was very interesting to see, and surprised to see some of the books that are already in there, but also which artists have a kind of substantial holding in the library and what that says. So as you were thinking about a certain blind spot of a kind of collection of the collection, which is always informed by syllabus, by the various departments, and very much impacted by the kind of budgetary parameters, where the budget lies, who gets to decide what books get to enter, and some places are much more fluid and some places are very rigid. But we also, I think, recognize some of the soft spots for certain types of books, or certain artists, or certain kind of topics. So it was a really, I want to kind of bring out what Laura says about the pleasures of promiscuous discovery and the transformative power of communion in the library. A kind of, the project not only speaks to what's lacking, but also really speaks to the intimate texture of the book form. So we're very much acknowledging this kind of polls of the range of what the project implies. And maybe this is a good kind of jumping point to the next word, which is care. I noticed in both of your work and both of your projects, there's a kind of care that displays, a care that is very much embedded in the practice of looking, for Heide, looking at another artist's work, and the attention and the care of that process. And for Laura, a kind of relationship that's being suggested in the picture and the photo, a kind of vulnerable position in a way where someone's back is exposed to your lens and you're looking. And I just have a quick kind of comment about it, but I want to ask you about this process of maybe vulnerability and care. But I also noticed, because I know some of the people that you photographed, Laura, I'm reminded of this often happens, and maybe it happened to some of us, where we thought we recognized somebody and we call them out, they turn around and it's not the person that we thought it was. So I wonder if the book in the library, this process also happens, where the cover of the book and the inside of the book creates a kind of not misrecognition, but it brings us to a different place. It brings us to a stranger place than the cover suggests. So I just kind of, I want to point that out. That's something I'm thinking about right now.
Like, so it's a little bit of a feint, right? Like FEINT, like you're sort of, you're expecting one thing and then you're actually led into a sort of more complex, like discursive space, so to speak, like back to the library, back to the body.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. And I think, I mean, I think one of the things too, and I don't know if I have like this is just kind of, this is just a very, like, just responding really directly to what you're saying, but I think, and this goes to, I think, some of, you know, the politics of the project. And, you know, it's very striking to me that its scope and its impact is not about a corrective, but it is more about like a sort of sense of possibilities, right? And sort of beginning to, and maybe it's just about like having questions or asking questions in some ways. And I, you know, the thing, and then just to kind of go back to the photographs, and I'm not quite sure if this links up, but I'll just throw it out there in the spirit of sort of fully exploiting our sort of our index structure here, is that there's a way in which making those photographs, like, so of course I'm involved in like an active production and a sort of communing with this person, but like I liken it more to like when you're sharing space with somebody and you're not talking, right? And I, you know, in terms of parenting, I sort of refer to it as the potted plant thing, where like I'll just be in the room, you know, and I'm not like kind of talking like this, like it's more like I'm just kind of there and we're sharing space. And there's an aspect to making the photographs that's like that, because, you know, it's not that people aren't aware of being photographed, they're totally aware of it, but it's more that there's still a little bit of a, yeah, there's still a little bit of a kind of, that it feels private for them. And that, like, in some ways circles back a little bit to what Heide was saying in terms of thinking about her drawings as a kind of private and intimate collection.
We had yesterday also this point where I think, Joey, you were saying it's like how does it feel to behold, like in the moment the photograph is taken, you like the camera is beholding the person who is portraited from behind. And so in that sense, that's this passive form of not having the beholder, but being behold. I thought that was a very beautiful description also. And yeah, and I think this the trajectory of that, what I see in the photographs, is very strongly about what is ahead of these women, what are they actually looking at, and what is their perspective. The next term would be community space, and I think there's in the essay of Liz there was this point of where she directed to the, or she's talking about the silent reader, and also how we experience the library space as a space where we are usually kind of disciplined and we are expected to be not disturb the others. And but at the same time, it is like this: you might share a space with other readers that have been reading the book before. So it's the imagined community of that what the book holds. Yes, and then at the same time, it is of course the expansion of that what the portrait is, like the very private relationship. I think it could be a space like the library space where we watch each other developing ideas and are kind of cared, or in the best case we would be cared by each other. Yeah. At this, maybe I want to add at this point, like we say in the introduction, we reject the idea of the library space as a silent space, which has more the connotation of like that now I almost would lead over to a keyword that is coming later, but like that it is a space also of practice. Mm-hmm. And that reading is like as much as it can reading. It's something else is happening when the sound is in the space and we hear the words. Then when they are like printed down and they remain silent, and the act of reading is without a voice.
In terms of community space, and also thinking about this this text by Nalini Noel called "Camouflage for Fire," which is I think actually quite informed the way we approach the presentation of the project in some ways, because in "Camouflage for Fire," Melanie is witnessing a performance taking place. So there's this kind of a kind of acknowledgement of the present moment, and the acknowledgement of a kind of beauty, let's say, that it's it being enacted in front of her eyes. So there's a kind of intimate space being created between the audience and the performer, and the spectator, and the dancers. And I find this to be an important aspect of what we've enlarged, the kind of community space that is no longer connected to just the library at the Royal Academy of Art in Antwerp, but the space that links all the different types of libraries together, and in so doing, from the museum space to artist-run space, trying to maybe reimagine the peculiarities of those spaces once we maybe re-emerge from the pandemic. How those, what are the protocols? I mean, the libraries traditionally have many protocols, and now we're living with many protocols. I'm very interested in how the negotiation of that very intimate space of the library will come. The next word was intimacy, which is sort of what we started to kind of talk about. I have a question for you, Heide, in terms of, maybe this is a little bit kind of on the side of what we've been talking about, but I want to hear a little bit about your relationship to the artist whose work you become intimate with, and how might it have transformed your ways of making or your own practice, and that intimate space you build with another artist through the act of looking?
I think, or it's the relationship to the artist I have been, whose drawings I have been redrawing is very different. Some are artists that I admire and that I know for a long time. Others are really like, I had interest in a certain time for them, and like. I think that in the influence, like the process of translating, so of course you always make an interpretation in the moment you draw. You take things out or you change them, and I think I reduced many of the drawings. I made them more simple. I don't know if you find that in other works back, or if that has changed aspects of other. Yeah, so that's not a. It's not a very opening answer. Something that really that for me came out of the drawing is this translating into the third dimension, working with rope. That's something that developed out of the drawings itself, like, which is not related directly to the practice of another artist, but it's like making it, translating it into material. And the relationship in the question of how the intimacy, or how I think I can mention the work of Ulrike Grossart. She is also a teacher, or she was a teacher of mine, and there I felt like that that it helped me to understand. It's very simple. It's also like it's a close reading of a work. Yeah.
I like that idea of intimacy as a kind of translation process. Intimacy between a person and a space, a person and a person, in Laura's case, an artwork and another artwork, as a kind of reproducing, ever continuing sense of relation and sensation.
Maybe one aspect is also like, which is like not only the aspect of understanding, but also the question of authorship. You repeat something, you take something, and where it also feels maybe as something that is violating the violating the authorship of another person. But then at the same time, of course, there's an ambivalence in it, but it's also like it's so much something else that it doesn't it's not that it doesn't matter, but it's kind of it's an aspect that is present. And since we talk here about reproduction, it's like a form of a personal inscription, and I think it just puts also the whole idea of originality into question, and is maybe saying like, okay, we are all continuing from a certain line, and we repeat things that have been already articulated before, and we enforce them.
Yeah, I want to jump in here, and of course I'm going to be cribbing from my own notes from another index, but and I hope someone will help me with the citation. I think it's Melanie Knoll, and talking about your drawings, and it says, and this is with regards to a notion about reproduction, is a species of boomerang, part rose. And like for me, this really beautiful tie-in too, and again, this has like so much to do with the inscription, the copying, the repetition, intimacy, in reproduction. Like reproduction is so often figured in terms, like mechanical terms, right? And not in bodily terms. And, there's something too about like, and we're speaking to a room full of students now, where there's a kind of you know, in a conservatory model of art education where there's, you know, like it is through practice and repetition that you are mastering, and I use that word very, you know, pointedly, you're mastering skill. But the notion of a boomerang, right, is so different, right? It's like already setting up these really, you know, these other kinds of dynamics about like relationship to, you know, sort of even like whether it's, you know, like influences, like with peers, like, you know, kind of forms of dialogue. And yeah, I just like, I thought that was such a, I thought that was such a beautiful image to describe what's going on, like in the like the spirit of your drawings, Heide. And it's just really kind of stuck with me all morning as I've been thinking about our talk today. I think
sorry.
No, go.
I was reminded of the kind of invisible line that all the books draw in the space of the library as well. One of the things that we decided to do with the Ex Libris in the book is it mentions what's the next book and the book before it, and thus in a way leading you in the space of the library as a kind of a kind of route that it's invisible other than by the person who's following one of the books in the second shelf project. And also how the two libraries, in a way, as a mirror that don't quite mirror each other. Of course, they're not identical. They're very different types of art schools in very different kind of cultural context, in a very different kind of pedagogical perspective, and the relationship between students and teachers are also very different. So I like how the mirroring is always also distorting and giving another kind of a different view, and maybe then reverting back as a kind of acknowledgement that none of what we do as people that who work and who breathe alongside other artists and thinkers in our context in art schools, none of that is neutral, because we can see very clearly it's a different set of protocols elsewhere. I think that's one of the, to me, kind of characteristics of the project with the mirror site is it is a distorted mirror in some sense, that it reveals all the very peculiar ways in which we work. I also have to say, maybe mention in Columbus, all the books were collected as part of the purview or budgetary kind of parameters of what the library already does. So in a way, it doesn't create another set of, it's not creating another set of funding structure. It uses and collaborates with what's already there as a kind of exchange that would otherwise be invisible, right? The selection of books in the library is being facilitated, but this kind of puts everything, certain aspects of it into something more visible for the people who work and teach and collaborate in the art schools.
So this might be a good moment to transition to the next index item, which is labor. And so I want to build off of something that Joey was just saying, and maybe sort of figure out how to how to pose this as a question, but I think, and I'm thinking very specifically here of Heide's drawings and Joey's work as a curator, as the director of the Beeler Galleries, and this sort of notion of how to make labor not just visible but legible, like and which sort of supposes a kind of a kind of rooting in process, and again, like the ways in which people are kind of brought into, whether it's a gallery, whether it's in like looking at a collection of drawings, like a sort of it's not just durational, but it's like a sort of experience of being. And having had the opportunity to work with you, Joey, like there's something, I mean, I feel like I had a kind of transformative experience, like witnessing your approach, which you term as slow programming. And I'm wondering maybe if you could just talk a little bit about the relationship of slow programming and this notion of making labor legible.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, the idea of slow programming was, for me, as a former director of a gallery that's situated within an art and design school context, was to think about the academic year as a kind of durational space, and think of time as an element in which projects and artworks and activities could flow in and out at unpredictable, unresolved sequences, meaning that every academic year, a different approach would surface. And to do so means a kind of relearning and checking one's kind of metabolism, institutional metabolism, and to really not to stay static. So, and a kind of taking the pressure off of kind of goal-oriented nature of art education, where students are asked to think about their thesis exhibition the first day they arrive, and teachers are also asked to do the same for the students. So really it really stems from my interest and my education in the art schools, and being exposed to many different protocols and approaches to integrate some of the things that I find useful or would have found useful for myself as a person who continues to learn, as a kind of educator and a person who oversees the physical space. And I think the physicality of an art gallery distinguishes the role of the manager or director of an art space, or a person who works in the library, from maybe other departments, and where, since both the library and the gallery are technically not departments where there are students who major in the gallery, or students who major in the library, but it's the space that feels very much unaccounted for in the scope of what education means. I think what space and what kind of labor, back to the term of the index. So I was really thinking about, making visible some of the processes of working as a way maybe just to say we're here, as much as this, maybe that idea of resistance and vulnerability in your pictures, in the photographs, Laura. What if an institution functions that way, where it allows for this space where one feels comfortable to have their back turned towards another. And what if we work that way? Yeah, that's kind of the thinking behind slow programming. And it also makes a kind of joke on the kind of insistence on this kind of slowness in so much of our everyday life. Yet it's quite contradictory at the same time, the speediness of production and kind of capital and goal of how we consume and work.
Maybe the work that we did in the library of photographing the books for the website, doing the index, like meant that we played librarians, like we were actually there and we did the same work than what the librarian in a Boegmans would do also. So we replicated or read it. And I don't know, with Ersi together we were present in the space, and that also kind of was a way of making things visible and showing. Even there were encounters and there were also not encounters. So I think that's in a different way. It's also part of that. A slow approach, though maybe not conscious in the moment yet of what it would do.
I wonder if we should jump to our last word, which is
yes.
voice, and see if there are any of the voices in the audience who might want to emerge and join us. I think you think there are going to be some questions.
I think, are there questions in the room to hear different voices? We would have a microphone, I think, that we could pass around, and if there are. At the moment, there's not yet well, there is a question coming.
Is it on? Yes.
Yeah.
So I think you have been spending a lot of time in libraries. If I am correct, I'm not that acquainted with your work. I did hear your name being mentioned by Thomas Crombie in relation to a peculiar fact, but I don't remember. So maybe it will come forth when we speak. I was just wondering, being in this library, what would you read?
That's a good question in that sense. So now being in the library, it was really about adding books towards the collection. So it was really the physical labor of working with the books that were newly acquired. And these books are documented on the second shelf website, so to say. So that's the answer within the project.
So maybe then another question would be, when you read, what would you like, or what do you read, apart from your own project, maybe?
Like as a it's a broad question. So
it's a very broad question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but maybe I can rephrase. Maybe I can ask you, because I'm not that acquainted with your work, and I just saw the book, and I saw the name of Nietzsche, for instance, written with the E and the I inverted, right?
Yes.
So maybe that's a way. Is there an interest in philosophy? Is there an interest in the archive or the philosophy of the archive?
Mm-hmm. So that drawing is a drawing by Paul Tang, and so it's a it's a redrawing of how he has been writing Nietzsche. So it's something where a mistake is happening. I repeat that again, but and it's a drawing. Susan is lecturing on Nietzsche, and Susan is in this case Susan Sontag, and so it is kind of talking about a relationship between I guess these two people had also, and interestingly I think he is pointing to Susan Sontag on like maybe being the authoritative voice in that moment, or also a voice that he maybe didn't want to hear. Yeah, and so that's one artist. I think there are several drawings of in that collection. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I would like to ask.
Closer to the mouse.
Okay. So your project is kind of the approach to fill the holes in a library that have been created by a certain system of collecting books in a library in a certain institution and so on. And then you're doing this labor really, and you're saying it's physical labor of filling these holes and hand-picking it and so on. And you're also repeating it in other institutions. And I'm wondering if there's a way of building a system, or if there's a way for you of building a system that even without doing this sort of labor, there's some sort of system that can just be applied to another library and then to find the holes and to fill them, or to make sure there's no holes coming up in the future.
I maybe give a first answer, and then maybe Joey or someone else can also add up to that. I think it's a fascinating idea to have a system to fill all gaps, but I think that's not what is solving the problem. I think it's work that has to be done every time. Again, you have to identify the gaps, but also the books that you want, so to say. So it's an active part involved. But I think there are certain methodologies that are interesting. Like, for example, if I think David Senior has been pointing to this in his essay. So the work of small publishers is very strongly directed to the work of underrepresented artistic groups or artists, and so it would ask libraries to do the work, not to go into predefined acquisition models, but to make the effort to get in contact with small publishers themselves, or with a very specific book dealer who is having these books in its assortment. Yeah, Joey.
I think we wanted our project to be not completely mirrored and implemented in other libraries, so we would hope that it creates a kind of interest so that people can form their own coalition, either within their own schools or with other schools, and to offer what we did as a starting point. I think we at one point thought about how we can systematize what we've done, but we also acknowledge that this has to really come out of the people who are part of the institution, and that it can't come from just as we did form our own coalition at our own accord. Other people have to also keep that spirit. So not to do other second shelves elsewhere, but maybe find their own ways of addressing the kind of void and lack of representation in their own library.
I think one. Yeah. Is there another question? I think maybe I would like to use this moment also to repeat a call like that the library commission at the school here is actually looking for new members, student members, to to be active in the role of suggesting books for the library. So if any one of you feels an agency there, that would be very much appreciated, and you could get in contact with Ine Buchmans. Yes. Vijay?
This commission you just mentioned, was that something implemented after Second Shelf or influenced, or was that already there before?
I think it's at the same time, and it has very much also to do with the role that Ine is taking as a librarian. I think, but I think forces are. How do you say that? They add up. They build up. Mm-hmm.
And then my question would be, can you maybe, from your point of view, what has the institution or the academy learned from this project? Maybe in these actions like this, if it's related or not, or
like a very crucial part is, I think, that the budget has been identified for the library that is stable or growing, and that is something that was not for the whole process the case. Yeah, and I think I don't know that. That's maybe also a question into you or into the space. I think that that space as a resource is much more taken into account and seen also as a place that needs care.
And then a follow-up question, one last one. As an artist, what did you learn from this institutional work that you were all engaged with, negotiating with the institutions and opening up this space, and then working towards filling these spaces? And what was learned this 2 years of doing this kind of work?
I think so it was a learning process in that sense that I didn't know how the project would develop. So in that sense, there were certain insecurities at the beginning. I think what I learned is that I would have involved more people from the very beginning within the institution, sharing my questions. Like, I think I carried for a too long time the questions that I had myself within me, and I think making that process more open and accessible would have accelerated the process. Yes. The other part is it's important to be stubborn and to stick to an idea. Yeah. And I think also a broader communication, like even it was well communicated, I think it could have been like, could have reached more people also, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Laura, do you have some thoughts on that question? I think Laura's having technical difficulty there. It's interesting, Heide, what you just expressed. I think on my end, I've learned, I think we would also have benefited from maybe one of the questions earlier. It's interesting. What would it be like if we had approached other schools in the early stage to kind of form a network of second shelves among different countries, and what we can learn in the process from that. Again, thinking about maybe building it into something that's a larger network. But I have to say, I also learned that it's important to keep projects open-ended and undefined. And what really our project benefited was that it was not defined as, at least on my end, so tightly, meaning the kind of convergence and proximity between Heide and Laura's work were really through a process of long looking. So and recognizing that it takes time to activate projects.
Like we have, I think, to stop here. Like I think the Zoom is not running for a long time anymore. I don't know. I just got the information. So even if it's now an interruption, I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank Joey and Laura for joining in here and bridging the time zones and sharing the part of the process of making the book and other parts.
Thank you.
Thank you, Heide.
Yeah.
Thanks to everyone.
Yeah. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Joey.